the children sold their elderly mother's house, divided the inheritance, and sent her to spend her final days in a nursing home. 3 years later, they returned and couldn't believe what they saw. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the old family home stood empty, its windows darkened and yard overgrown, a stark contrast to the memories once held there. Margaret, now in her late 70s, had lived in that house her entire life, raising her 3 children, pouring years of love and sacrifice into its walls. But, as age took its toll, so did her children's patience. Margaret's eldest, Stephen, had always been practical to a fault. "Mom, the house is too much for you to handle," he'd insisted, his tone gentle but unwavering. Beside him, his sister Laura nodded, a faint sadness in her eyes that didn't quite mask the resignation underneath. "It's better this way, Mom. You'll be well taken care of," she added, her voice laced with the unspoken convenience of having their inheritance sooner. Margaret had no choice but to agree, reluctantly handing over the keys to the home that held a lifetime of memories. She was moved to a nursing facility miles away, where her children barely visited. Her youngest, Ben, had initially protested, but he, too, was eventually convinced by his siblings. They all believed they were doing what was best. The years passed in the silence of a small, sterile room, with only a handful of visitors from the outside world. Margaret grew quieter, her once bright eyes dimming with each passing day. The last words she had spoken to her children were a quiet, heartfelt, "I just want you to be happy," as they left her behind, not understanding the full weight of her words. 3 years later, on a warm spring day, Stephen, Laura, and Ben pulled up in front of the nursing home, expecting nothing but a routine visit. Instead, they found the parking lot filled with strangers, and the building almost unrecognizable, vibrant with life and brimming with a sense of renewal. A chill ran down Stephen's spine. "What's going on here?" he muttered, glancing at his siblings, who looked equally bewildered. They stepped inside, only to be met with the shock of their lives. The nursing home had once felt like a last stop, a dim and lifeless place where people passed their final days with only the ticking of a clock for company. But now, as Margaret's children walked the hallways, it seemed transformed. Fresh coats of paint brightened the walls, and laughter echoed from a common room down the corridor. Windows that had been covered with blinds now opened up to let in the sun, casting a warmth that had been missing for years. Stephen, usually unshaken, found himself uneasy. "Did they renovate?" he murmured, his gaze sweeping over the place. "It doesn't make sense," Laura whispered, her brow furrowed. "I mean, nursing homes don't just change like this." Ben, the youngest and always the most sensitive of the 3, walked with his head slightly lowered. He had never quite forgiven himself for not fighting harder to keep their mother in her home. As he observed the lively scene around him, a hint of guilt flickered in his eyes, but he quickly pushed it down. As they reached the common room, a familiar voice drifted out, a voice that hadn't held such joy in years. Margaret sat at a table near the window, a group of elderly residents gathered around her, listening intently as she spoke. Her face was animated, and her once dull eyes sparkled with a liveliness they hadn't seen in ages. She laughed at something one of the residents said, her laughter full and rich, echoing through the room. "Mom?" Stephen's voice was barely a whisper, his shock unmistakable. Margaret turned slowly, her gaze resting on each of her children in turn. A quiet smile played on her lips, one that seemed to carry a weight of understanding they couldn't quite place. "Hello, my dears," she greeted them softly. "It's been a while." The warmth in her voice took them aback, as though she were speaking to old friends rather than her own children. Laura shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of her mother's gaze. We didn't expect this," she stammered. Margaret's smile grew, though her eyes held a flicker of something unreadable. "People find new ways to live when they're given the chance," she replied, glancing at the residents around her. "I had some help." The siblings looked at each other, a silent confusion hanging between them. How had their mother, who once seemed so defeated, found herself in the center of this vibrant community? The siblings stood in stunned silence, their eyes scanning the room, trying to process the scene unfolding before them. The once faded walls of the nursing home were now freshly painted, adorned with colorful artwork created by the residents, and even the faint scent of lavender drifted through the air. Gone was the quiet resignation that once permeated the halls. In its place, there was laughter, lively conversations, and a palpable sense of joy that seemed out of place in a nursing home. Stephen's gaze remained fixed on his mother, sitting at a sunlit table surrounded by a small group of elderly residents who listened to her every word. Margaret was animated, her gestures lively and her smile radiant, a stark contrast to the woman he'd last seen, worn down by age and solitude. It was almost as if she had found a new purpose. Unable to contain his confusion any longer, Stephen took a step forward, clearing his throat to catch her attention. "Mom? What's going on here?" Margaret looked up, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that was both welcoming and strangely distant. "Oh, Stephen, Laura, Ben. I didn't expect to see all of you here," she replied, her tone calm but carrying an undertone of something they couldn't quite place. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Laura shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Mom, we didn't expect this," she murmured, her gaze drifting around the room as if searching for an explanation. Margaret's smile softened, but her eyes held a quiet resilience. People can find new ways to live, even when it seems like there's nothing left. Sometimes, the most unexpected places offer a second chance. She glanced around at the residents, her friends, who looked at her with admiration and respect. "I had a little help along the way." Ben, the youngest of the siblings, had always been the most sentimental, and he couldn't shake the pang of guilt gnawing at him. It had been his voice that wavered and they decided to sell the house, his objections quieted only by his siblings' insistence that their mother needed professional care. Now, he found himself wondering if he had been wrong. "Help?" he asked softly, as though afraid of the answer. Before Margaret could respond, a petite, sprightly woman seated next to her spoke up. "Margaret has been our guiding light," the woman said, her voice filled with pride. "She's the reason this place feels like a home now." "Our mother?" Laura's brow furrowed in confusion. She glanced between Margaret and the woman, struggling to connect the vibrant person before her with the mother they had left behind. "What do you mean?" Margaret shrugged, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "Life is full of lessons, Laura, even when we think we've learned everything. This place, it had more to offer than I expected." Her tone was gentle, almost as if she were speaking to children who couldn't possibly understand the experiences she had lived. The siblings exchanged glances, each processing Margaret's words in their own way. Stephen, ever the pragmatist, was already scrutinizing the nursing home's transformation, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. Laura, the one who had been most resolute in her decision, felt a pang of irritation mixed with confusion, unable to reconcile the joyful woman before her with the one she had reluctantly left behind. Ben, however, found himself drawn to the subtle changes in his mother's demeanor, the newfound confidence, the way she spoke with a conviction he had never seen in her before. "Mom, this doesn't make any sense. The last time we were here, you weren't like this." Margaret tilted her head thoughtfully. "I suppose I wasn't, was I?" she replied softly. "Sometimes, Ben, we don't realize how much we're capable of until we're forced to find a new path." A nurse passed by, pausing briefly to smile at Margaret and nod respectfully before continuing on her way. It was a gesture the siblings noticed, a sign of respect, almost reverence, as if Margaret were more than just a resident here. As if she were someone to look up to. "Mom, just how involved have you been in all of this?" Stephen asked, his tone wary. He glanced around, taking in the transformed space, the residents' happy expressions, the warmth that radiated from every corner. This was not the place they remembered. Margaret leaned back slightly, a playful smile dancing on her lips. "Oh, I suppose you could say I've become a bit of a leader here," she said with a wink. "It started small, just helping organize little things, suggesting improvements. But then, well, one thing led to another, and here we are." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Leader? Margaret?" The same woman who had once depended on them for everything now commanded the respect of the entire community. Laura took a step closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom, why didn't you tell us any of this?" Margaret's gaze softened. "Would you have listened?" Her words were gentle but pointed, carrying a truth none of them wanted to confront. She let the silence linger, allowing the weight of her question to settle over them. "Sometimes, we have to find our own answers. You all have lives to lead, and I found a new one here." For a moment, none of the siblings spoke. They were grappling with the realization that, while they had moved on, Margaret had found a way to reclaim her own life in a place they had deemed hopeless. In their eyes, they had rescued her by placing her here, but perhaps she had been the one to rescue herself. As they stood there, unsure of what to say, Margaret's friend leaned over, a mischievous smile on her face. "Margaret didn't just change this place, she saved it," she whispered, her voice carrying a reverent tone. "And it's only the beginning." The siblings lingered in the common room, each lost in their thoughts, struggling to reconcile the past with the present. Stephen's mind raced with questions, his practical nature grappling with the idea that he might have overlooked something vital about his own mother. Meanwhile, Laura's expression shifted from bewilderment to a guarded defensiveness, her gaze darted around the room, noting each warm exchange Margaret shared with the residents. "Mom, we thought you'd be, well, taken care of here." "Not running the place," Laura finally said, her voice laced with a hint of disbelief. Margaret chuckled softly. "Oh, Laura, life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? I used to think the same way, you know. That there was only one way to live, settling down, doing what was expected. But this place gave me a chance to see things differently." She glanced at her friends, her voice softening. "And to remind others that they have value, too." Ben looked around, noticing the small projects scattered across tables, handmade decorations, colorful paintings, a knitting station where half-finished scarves and blankets rested, each item crafted with a sense of purpose. He felt an unexpected pang of pride but kept his thoughts to himself. "Do they pay you for all this?" Stephen asked abruptly, attempting to make sense of the logistics. Margaret's smile remained steady. "Not in the way you're thinking. I don't need money here. What I receive is much greater than that, a community, a reason to get up each morning." A middle-aged nurse approached them, extending a hand with a warm smile. "You must be Margaret's family. I'm Ruth. I work closely with your mother, and I must say, she's made a profound difference here. We don't know what we'd do without her." Stephen looked skeptical. "But this is a nursing home. How can a resident make such a big impact?" Ruth chuckled, sharing a knowing glance with Margaret. "Well, Margaret here has a way of inspiring people. She proposed ideas for activities, brought people together, even helped fundraise for the new art and music programs. Her determination became contagious." Laura crossed her arms, visibly uncomfortable. "But, isn't that the staff's job? I mean, she's here to rest, not work." Margaret's gaze sharpened, a quiet fire in her eyes. "Laura, rest isn't what I needed. This," she gestured to the transformed room, "is the life I needed. I thought I'd lost everything, my home, my independence, but I found something far more valuable here. Purpose. Belonging." A young volunteer joined them, carrying a bundle of flowers, smiling warmly at Margaret. "Here you go, Margaret. Fresh from the garden, just like you asked." "Thank you, dear," Margaret said, accepting the flowers and placing them in a vase on the table. The siblings watched, taken aback by the effortless way she commanded respect and kindness from everyone around her. As the volunteer left, Margaret turned back to her children, her expression thoughtful. "I know this isn't what you expected, and maybe it doesn't make sense to you. But I've found something meaningful here, something I wouldn't have found anywhere else." Ben felt a swell of emotion he hadn't anticipated. He glanced at his siblings, sensing that they, too, were beginning to question the choices they had made. He stepped forward, his voice quiet. "Mom. I'm sorry. We didn't realize that you'd feel this way." Margaret reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "Oh, Ben, there's no need to apologize. I know you all meant well. And maybe I needed this change as much as you did. Sometimes, life takes us down paths we wouldn't choose, but those paths can lead us to the most beautiful places." Stephen, still processing, couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that there was more to this story than his mother was letting on. "You keep saying you found purpose, but it's almost as if you're holding something back. What aren't you telling us?" Margaret hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. The light streaming in softened her features, and for a moment, she looked younger, her spirit unburdened. "There are some things that are hard to explain, Stephen. I suppose you could say that I found my voice again. And I don't plan to lose it." Her cryptic answer only deepened the siblings' curiosity. Laura, never one to leave things unsaid, stepped closer, her voice a mixture of frustration and yearning. "Mom, we don't want to feel like strangers to you. Can't you tell us more?" Margaret regarded her children with a calm smile. "Perhaps it's time for all of you to get to know me as I am now, rather than who I was. And maybe," she added, her gaze lingering on each of them, "it's time for each of you to consider what purpose really means in your own lives." The siblings exchanged uncertain glances, feeling both challenged and drawn to the woman before them, a woman they were beginning to realize they had never truly known. Margaret's words hung in the air, stirring something inside each of them that felt both unfamiliar and strangely welcome. As the siblings stood in silence, absorbing their mother's words, a sudden commotion at the entrance caught their attention. A small group of residents gathered, their faces animated, clapping and cheering as a man in a suit entered, accompanied by a few young women holding clipboards and cameras. The man's confident stride and warm smile suggested he was familiar with the place, and his arrival seemed to excite everyone present. Ben leaned toward his mother, eyebrows raised. "Who's that?" Margaret's eyes sparkled with a mixture of pride and anticipation. "Oh, that's Mr. Peters. He's been working with me on a little project." "A project?" Stephen asked, his tone edged with suspicion. Margaret smiled knowingly, motioning for them to follow her as she joined the group welcoming Mr. Peters. The siblings exchanged a puzzled glance but trailed after her, intrigued by the strange turn of events. "Margaret." Mr. Peters greeted her warmly, extending a hand that she clasped with familiarity and respect. "I just wanted to stop by and personally thank you for everything you've done. The foundation couldn't have achieved this without you." The siblings exchanged bewildered looks. "Foundation?" Laura whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. Margaret turned to her children, her gaze steady. "Yes, the foundation. Over the past couple of years, we've been working to establish a fund for elderly empowerment programs, resources for those who feel forgotten. It's been a passion project of mine." Stephen blinked, as if trying to process this new information. "But, Mom, how did you even get involved in something like this?" Margaret hesitated, her smile softening. "Well, Stephen, you'd be surprised what you can accomplish when you stop seeing yourself as helpless. I had some savings set aside, and I realized that there were people here with incredible talents, skills they hadn't been able to share in years. Together, we started small, art classes, music sessions, fitness programs. Soon, word spread, and the foundation was born." Mr. Peters turned to the siblings, his expression respectful. "Your mother's vision is inspiring. What started as a few ideas blossomed into a full-fledged movement. She's given these residents a renewed sense of purpose, and a legacy to be proud of." Ben's face softened, a look of awe replacing his earlier guilt. "Mom. I had no idea. I thought we'd left you here to rest, not to change the world." Margaret chuckled, patting his arm affectionately. "Sometimes, the most surprising things grow from what seems like an end. This place was my beginning, and I wanted to give that same chance to others." As they spoke, the young women with cameras approached, one of them politely asking if they could take a few photos with Margaret for an upcoming feature on the foundation's work. Margaret nodded gracefully, allowing the woman to guide her into a well-lit corner of the room while the siblings watched, speechless. Stephen, ever the pragmatist, leaned toward Mr. Peters. "But, how is this all funded? Isn't this supposed to be a nursing home?" Mr. Peters smiled. "It's still a nursing home, but with Margaret's influence, we've received donations, grants, and even small sponsorships. People want to support something that gives back to those who've given so much of their lives." Margaret didn't just sit back, she reached out, made connections, brought people together. She turned this place into a model for what elder care could be. A nurse nearby overheard and chimed in, "To be honest, we all look up to her. Margaret's energy and compassion have changed the way we see our work, too. She's given all of us a new perspective." Laura, who had been silent, took a tentative step forward. "Mom, all these years, we thought we were doing you a favor, giving you a place to be safe. But you've been doing something much bigger." Margaret's gaze softened as she looked at her daughter. "You did give me something, Laura. You gave me freedom. Freedom from expectations, from the life I thought I was supposed to lead. When you brought me here, I was forced to let go of the past, and in doing so, I discovered a part of myself I didn't know existed." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with each of them. The siblings felt a mixture of pride and regret, realizing they had underestimated her strength and resilience. Margaret was no longer just their mother, she was a beacon of hope, not only for the residents here but for themselves as well. The siblings were still processing the shock of their mother's influence on the nursing home. They had thought they were taking care of her by leaving her there, but now they were faced with a woman they barely recognized, a woman who had created something extraordinary in their absence. Ben was the first to break the silence. "Mom, why didn't you tell us about all of this? About the foundation, about everything you've done here?" Margaret gave him a gentle smile. "You never needed to know," she replied softly. "This was my own journey, something I needed to discover on my own." Stephen, ever the skeptic, couldn't hide his disbelief. "So you're telling us you were able to do all of this just by organizing a few activities?" Margaret's gaze held steady, a glimmer of something unreadable in her eyes. "Sometimes, Stephen, the resources you need find their way to you when your purpose is clear." Before Stephen could probe further, they noticed a change in their mother's expression, a flicker of discomfort, a slight tightening of her jaw as she placed a hand over her chest. Laura's eyes narrowed in concern. "Mom, are you all right?" Margaret tried to wave it off, but her face was pale, and her breathing seemed unsteady. "Oh, it's nothing," she murmured, though her voice was weaker than before. She closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering her strength, but it was clear that something was wrong. One of the staff members, who had been watching nearby, hurried over, gently supporting Margaret's arm. "Margaret, you don't look well. Let's get you some help." The siblings exchanged worried glances, a growing sense of unease settling over them. As the staff member called for assistance, a nurse arrived quickly, moving to Margaret's side with practiced calm. She glanced at the siblings before speaking, her tone gentle yet direct. "Your mother was diagnosed with heart failure some years ago," she said quietly. She didn't want anyone to know. Margaret insisted on keeping it private, she didn't want it to hold her back, especially not from this. The siblings stood frozen, each absorbing the gravity of the nurse's words. Not only had their mother hidden her illness, but she had done so while transforming the lives of those around her. She had managed all of this alone, without them. The weight of their guilt and admiration hung thick in the air. As the nurse helped Margaret into a chair, she looked up at her children, her gaze both weary and resolute. "I knew my time was limited," she admitted softly, her voice carrying a strength that belied her frail appearance. "But I also knew I had more to give. And the resources to make it happen." Stephen, still grappling with what he was hearing, couldn't help but ask, "Resources? Mom, where did you get the money to fund all of this?" A silence fell over the room as Margaret's eyes met his, her expression revealing the depths of a truth she had kept hidden. "I had some money set aside. More than you would have expected. It was something I saved for years, something I never told anyone about. Laura's mouth dropped open, her mind racing. Wait, are you saying that the money you used for all of this was yours? Margaret nodded, a faint smile gracing her lips. Yes. It was my fortune, my little secret. I wanted it to mean something, to go toward a purpose greater than myself. The siblings were stunned. All this time, they had assumed their mother was simply a resident at the nursing home, relying on the facility's standard care. They had never imagined that she was not only managing her life there but financing its transformation. Ben, who had been struggling with guilt, looked at her with a new sense of awe. So, all those improvements, the programs, the foundation, it was all because of you? Margaret took a slow breath, her gaze unwavering. Yes. I wanted to create a place where people like me, people who had been left behind, could find dignity, purpose, and community. This was my legacy. Stephen's face was pale, his voice barely a whisper. And you didn't think to tell us? You just went on, building this entire legacy in secret? Margaret's expression softened. Would it have made a difference if you'd known? She asked quietly. You all had your own lives, your own concerns. I didn't want this to be a burden or an expectation. I wanted it to be my choice. Her words hung heavy in the room, each sibling realizing, in that moment, just how little they had understood their mother. She had kept her fortune and her illness hidden, not out of secrecy, but out of a determination to create something meaningful without relying on them. She had redefined her life without them, finding strength and purpose that they had never recognized. As Margaret sat back, her hand still resting lightly over her heart, the siblings felt an overwhelming mix of pride, regret, and astonishment. Their mother, the woman they had thought fragile and dependent, had created a legacy that would outlast them all. The revelation of Margaret's hidden fortune left each of her children reeling. They had arrived expecting a routine visit to their mother, maybe even a quick in-and-out check-in. Instead, they had been confronted with an extraordinary reality, a legacy of purpose and impact that Margaret had built in secret. For Ben, it was a moment of deep introspection. He thought back to his reluctance 3 years earlier, his half-hearted protests when his siblings had suggested placing her in the nursing home. He had assumed that she would be better off there, with professional care and attention. Now, seeing what she had accomplished alone, Ben felt a surge of both pride and shame. You know, he said quietly, almost as if talking to himself, I used to think, maybe we were helping her, giving her a place to rest. He looked at his mother, his eyes filled with a newfound respect. But Mom, you didn't just rest here. You built something incredible. Margaret's gentle smile returned, though it was tinged with weariness. Sometimes, Ben, we don't know our own strength until we're forced to face the unknown. Being here gave me freedom in a way I'd never expected. It was a chance to create something new, a purpose for the years I had left. Laura, who had prided herself on her practicality, couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. She had seen Margaret as someone to be handled, a burden to be managed so they could all move forward with their lives. But looking at her now, Laura saw a woman she barely recognized, a woman who had found a deeper meaning, even when her own family hadn't been there to support her. I should have asked you what you wanted, Laura admitted, her voice faltering. I was so focused on what I thought was best that I never stopped to ask what mattered to you. Margaret reached out, taking her daughter's hand with a tenderness that both surprised and comforted Laura. We all have our journeys, Laura. This was mine. And in a way, maybe it was better that you didn't know. I was free to follow my heart without worrying about anyone else's expectations. Stephen, who had always been the most skeptical, stood in the corner, his arms crossed as he stared at the floor. He felt conflicted, his mind a jumble of resentment, guilt, and admiration. Part of him was still processing the idea that his mother had kept this fortune from them, a secret she had chosen to pour into strangers rather than her own family. I can't believe you kept all of this from us, Mom, he finally said, his tone rough with emotion. You didn't think we deserved to know? Margaret met his gaze, her eyes filled with understanding. Stephen, it wasn't about keeping things from you. I needed this to be my decision, my life. I spent so many years focused on being a mother, on making sure you were all taken care of, that I forgot I could do something just for me." Her words struck a chord, and for the first time, Stephen felt a shift in his perception. His mother wasn't just a caretaker, someone who existed solely to support her family. She was a person, a woman who had dreams and desires independent of them. And as painful as it was to admit, she had every right to follow those dreams, even if it meant doing so without their knowledge. Ben stepped forward, his face determined. "Mom, I want to help. If there's anything you need, if there's a way we can be part of this foundation, I want to support it." Margaret's expression softened, and she reached out to touch his arm. "Ben, that means so much to me. But this journey was mine, and I want each of you to find your own path. I don't want you to feel obligated to follow in my footsteps. You have your own lives to live." Laura, feeling the weight of her own regret, nodded. "But maybe we can find a way to honor what you've built here, Mom. Not because we have to, but because we want to. You showed us what it means to live with purpose. And I think we owe it to ourselves to try and do the same." Margaret's eyes glistened with emotion, a quiet pride shining through. She had spent years hoping her children would understand her decision, but seeing their newfound respect and willingness to learn from her journey brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. As they sat together, surrounded by the vibrant life Margaret had cultivated within the nursing home, the siblings began to see their mother not as a fragile woman who needed care, but as a guiding force, someone who had redefined what it meant to live fully, even when faced with adversity. For the first time, each of them felt inspired to take the lessons Margaret had shown them and apply them to their own lives. They understood now that true wealth lay not in money or possessions, but in the legacy one leaves behind, the lives touched, the love shared, and the strength to pursue meaning in even the most unexpected places. As the day wore on, the siblings stayed close to Margaret, each of them feeling the weight of everything they had learned. They walked the halls of the nursing home together, meeting the residents who held their mother in such high regard. The warmth and respect the staff and residents had for Margaret left the siblings in awe. Each interaction reinforced the profound impact she had made, a woman they had underestimated and, in many ways, neglected. In the late afternoon, they gathered in a small garden courtyard at the back of the home. The air was still, and Margaret sat on a wooden bench, her face softened in the golden light filtering through the trees. She looked serene, but the faint pallor in her cheeks hinted at her fatigue. Laura glanced at her brothers before gently placing a hand on her mother's shoulder. "Mom, I think we need to talk about your health." Margaret gave a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Oh, Laura. I've lived longer and fuller than I ever thought I would. Don't worry about me." But Stephen wasn't so easily reassured. "Mom, you hid your heart condition from us. You've been living with this on your own, pushing yourself to build all of this." He gestured around them. "Don't you think we deserve to know what's really going on with you?" Margaret sighed, her gaze drifting out over the courtyard. "I never wanted my life, or my legacy, to be about illness or limitations. I wanted this foundation, this community, to be something beautiful, something that could grow even after I was gone." The quiet admission hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. The siblings shared a glance, understanding now that their mother's work had been not just an act of transformation for others, but for herself as well, a way to confront her own mortality and leave something behind that could last. Ben's voice was barely a whisper. How long do you have?" Margaret gave him a sad smile, reaching out to hold his hand. "It's hard to say. The doctors told me it could be months, maybe less. But I've been living on borrowed time for a while now, and every day here has felt like a gift." The rawness of her words left each of them speechless. They had come here with the assumption that Margaret was simply living out her last days in quiet resignation. Instead, she had used those days to build a legacy, one that didn't just honor her, but also gave dignity and purpose to so many others. Margaret took a shaky breath, her gaze turning serious as she looked at each of her children. "I'm not asking you to continue this work, but I hope that seeing what I've done here might inspire you to find your own purpose. Money doesn't define a legacy. The lives you touch, the love you give, that's what truly matters. Stephen, who had always been driven by his career and financial success, felt a pang of discomfort. He had spent so many years chasing goals, accumulating wealth, and climbing the corporate ladder. Now, sitting beside his mother, he felt the weight of her words settling deep within him. "Mom, I never realized what you were capable of," he admitted quietly. "I thought I was the one who had everything figured out, but I was wrong." Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. "There's no shame in learning, Stephen. I spent years thinking my life was defined by being your mother. But there's always room to grow, to change, even in our final days." Laura's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I want to help, Mom. Not because I feel like I have to, but because I want to honor what you've built here." Ben nodded, a determined look on his face. "Me too. If there's any way we can support this foundation, we're here for you." Margaret's face softened, pride and love shining through her tired eyes. "Thank you, my loves. But remember, this foundation isn't just for me. It's for everyone here, those who have been forgotten, those who feel like they no longer matter. If you choose to be part of it, do it for them, not for me." They sat in silence, absorbing the quiet strength of her words, each of them coming to terms with the reality that their mother's time was running out. Margaret had found a way to leave a legacy that transcended wealth or status, a legacy built on compassion, dignity, and purpose. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Margaret's breaths grew slower, her strength visibly waning. The siblings moved closer, their hearts heavy with the understanding that these moments with her were precious and fleeting. They were not just saying goodbye to their mother, they were witnessing the final chapter of a life well lived, a life that had taught them more in a single day than they had learned in years. And as they sat beside her, watching the sun set over the courtyard, they made a silent promise, to carry forward the love, purpose, and resilience that Margaret had shown them, and to honor her legacy in whatever way they could. As night fell over the nursing home, the siblings stayed close to Margaret's side, sensing that time was slipping away faster than they had anticipated. The once lively courtyard was now bathed in a quiet, solemn glow, the world seeming to hold its breath alongside them. Margaret lay resting in her bed, her breathing shallow but steady. The lines of exhaustion on her face were softened by the peacefulness that came with acceptance. She had lived fully, despite the limitations of her illness, and she had made peace with her journey. Stephen, Laura, and Ben sat around her, each of them lost in their own reflections. The lessons of the day had shifted something fundamental within them, a transformation that was still settling in their minds and hearts. They understood now that Margaret had used her hidden fortune not out of extravagance or vanity, but out of a genuine desire to leave the world better than she had found it. Finally, Margaret's eyes fluttered open, and she smiled weakly at her children, as if savoring the sight of them one last time. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the strength of a lifetime. "I'm so proud of each of you," she murmured. "You may not realize it now, but you've each found your own path, and I know you'll do wonderful things." Ben leaned forward, his hand reaching out to hold hers. "Mom, we're going to make sure this place, this foundation, continues. We won't let what you built disappear." Margaret's gaze softened, her eyes shining with a quiet joy. "Thank you, Ben. But remember, this foundation was never about me. It's about the people it serves. That's the real legacy." Laura, her voice choked with emotion, spoke softly. "Mom, we didn't understand before. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry we didn't see you for who you really were." Margaret shook her head gently, a faint smile on her lips. "There's nothing to forgive, my love. Life has a way of teaching us what we need to know when we're ready to learn it." Stephen, who had always struggled to express his feelings, finally found the courage to speak. "I thought success was about money, about accomplishments. But you showed us what real success looks like. You built something meaningful, and you did it on your own terms." Margaret's eyes sparkled with pride, her hand reaching out to touch each of them in turn. "All I ever wanted was for you to live your lives fully, with purpose and compassion. And I know now, you will." Her breaths grew shallower, her eyes drifting closed as a sense of calm enveloped her. The siblings held their breaths, feeling the enormity of the moment, the quiet finality settling over them. In a final act of love, Margaret whispered, her voice fading, "Carry on, with open hearts. And remember, true wealth is in the lives you touch." And with that, her spirit left, leaving the siblings in profound silence, each holding on to her final words as though they were the most precious gift she could have given. After a few moments of silent mourning, Stephen, Laura, and Ben exchanged a look. There was pain, yes, but also a deep resolve. Margaret's legacy wasn't just in the foundation she had built, it was in the lives of everyone she had touched, including theirs. They knew now what they had to do, not just to honor her, but to carry forward the values she had instilled in them. Margaret had given them the greatest lesson of all, and as they sat in the glow of her memory, they felt a sense of purpose they had never known before. She had left them with a legacy of love, resilience, and compassion, a legacy they vowed to uphold, one life at a time. In the weeks that followed Margaret's passing, the siblings found themselves drawn together in a way they hadn't been in years. The shared experience of her final days, and the profound lessons she had imparted, lingered in their hearts and minds, shaping their choices and perspectives in ways they could never have anticipated. Stephen, who had always prided himself on his business success, began questioning the meaning of his work. He couldn't shake the memory of his mother's words, the idea that true wealth was in the lives one touched, not in numbers or achievements. Inspired by her legacy, he took a step back from his corporate career and started exploring ways he could give back to the community. He began volunteering his time at the foundation, using his skills to help with fundraising and strategic planning, determined to ensure that Margaret's work would continue to thrive. Laura, whose practical mindset had often led her to dismiss emotional matters, found herself reconnecting with her own family in a deeper, more meaningful way. Her mother's example had shown her the importance of compassion and presence, and she was determined to carry that forward. She took an active role in supporting the foundation's programs, helping to organize art and music therapy sessions for the residents, a small tribute to the love and joy Margaret had brought into their lives. Ben, the most sentimental of the three, embraced his mother's legacy wholeheartedly. He spent time with the residents who had known Margaret, listening to their stories and memories of her, each one painting a picture of the woman he realized he had never fully understood. He decided to work with the foundation directly, becoming involved in the day-to-day activities and advocating for the dignity and respect of elderly residents. In this work, he felt a connection to his mother's spirit, a way to honor her memory by continuing the mission she had started. As the months passed, the foundation blossomed under their combined efforts, becoming a beacon of hope and community for seniors who, like Margaret, had once felt forgotten. Her legacy was no longer just a private fortune or a quiet life, it had become a movement, something that would endure long after her passing. One afternoon, the three of them stood together in the courtyard where they had shared their final moments with Margaret. A plaque had been placed there in her memory, engraved with her final words, "True wealth is in the lives you touch." Stephen placed a hand on the plaque, his eyes filled with quiet resolve. "She gave us so much more than we ever realized. It's our turn to keep giving." Laura nodded, her hand resting on Ben's shoulder as they stood in a moment of shared reflection. They knew that Margaret's legacy was far more than a foundation, it was a way of life, a life built on compassion, dignity, and purpose. Each of them carried a piece of that legacy forward, a reminder of the mother who had shown them the true meaning of love and resilience. As they left the courtyard, the siblings felt the weight of her gift, and the memory of Margaret's gentle strength lingered with them, guiding their steps and inspiring them to live with the same open-hearted courage she had shown them. Years later, the foundation had grown beyond the small nursing home where Margaret had planted its roots. With branches across the state, the organization now supported elderly individuals from all walks of life, providing community, care, and purpose to those who needed it most. At every opening ceremony, a plaque with Margaret's words, "True wealth is in the lives you touch," stood as a testament to the woman who had started it all. In their own ways, Stephen, Laura, and Ben continued to carry her legacy forward. Each of them had found purpose beyond personal success, dedicating themselves to a life of compassion and meaning. And, whenever they visited the foundation, they felt her presence, a gentle reminder that their lives had been forever touched by a mother's love and resilience. Margaret's story reminds us that legacy is about more than wealth, it's about the lives we impact along the way. How can we bring meaning to our lives, just as she did? Share your thoughts, stories, or reflections, and join the conversation about the ways we can all leave a lasting impact on the world.